The global game has changed significantly, more than most society has seen in their lifetimes. So back in 2020, we saw companies flee Russia during the sanctions. It was about $50 billion of infrastructure that companies just left entirely with no question. Now we have a comparable scenario in China, although it's been happening and going on the last few years. They're experiencing extreme corporate outflow. Meanwhile, America is reindustrializing more than any of us have seen in our lifetimes. After companies realized how fragile the globalization model is, they deployed significant investment in onshore US manufacturing. As far as US manufacturing building goes, that is up around 50% around the last 50-year annual average. So it's going to take about a few years for it all to be built up, but when it's all turnkey, that's going to open the floodgates in production, jobs, ultimately higher US GDP. Remember, the states have a strategical advantage when it comes to its location in the world and trade. We have the Atlantic and the Pacific. When we start exporting more, that is another future factor where we can get more growth. So we are now net independent again in natural gas, and we are now the biggest producer of inputs that are necessary to make all of the chemicals. So think about that. That is a huge deal. So armchair economists are casting doom narratives about the demographic issues, but if you compare the US to the rest of the world, we're doing just fine. We're actually on the top of the world when it comes to that. China, Japan, and Germany are going through the demographic problems the worst in the entire world, and eventually will have a significant amount of their economy exported. China had a GDP miss this past month, and that's not shocking at all because, of course, even if they were to meet the expectations, their GDP is notorious for being way overcounted and inaccurate. Does not line up with the actual numbers. And remember, they overcounted their population by about 100 million people a few years ago. The government admitted to that. And we had the big builders like Evergrande and more still going on ever since Evergrande that are leaving people with high mortgages and no home built. Their banks are failing. They have bank runs. The busiest airports and shopping centers are now vacant en masse. So only a sliver of retail locations are open in the busiest centers of China, but more are closing by the day. China is also the biggest oil consumer in the world right now, but that is curtailing more and more by the month, and that is a good indicator that the Chinese contraction is going to continue. So the economic drivers are here for us to see that China is not an economic superpower like some people like to think. And let's face it, the US has control of the seas with their navy. They control all trade because of that. And now with Sweden joining NATO recently, we have even more allied naval power. Sweden has the second best navy in the world and has a strategic location next to Russia. And some people are worried about the conflict going on in the Eastern Europe, but the likelihood of a full-on hot war with Russia and NATO is highly unlikely. The Ukraine conflict will be drawn out as long as possible on both sides. Both sides aren't really in this fully. And NATO is using this as a way to test their new equipment. So it's actually a huge win for NATO when it comes to testing their new hypersonic technology and other stuff. So as long as the Ukraine front is prolonged, the less likely Russia will carry forward with their threats of nuclear strikes. So let's take a breath, let's calm down. After you look into it, the talking pundits are usually wrong, and they're definitely wrong about all of this going on. So remember, it's important to look at all this in a 1,000-foot view and not get bogged down by the talking heads.